Today is Saturday, July 12th. It's President Trump's biggest policy win so far, and it touches nearly every part of American life. From taxes and immigration to defense spending, food stamps, energy, healthcare, and even Olympic funding, it's all packed into what's called the One Big Beautiful Bill. And yes, that's the official name, not just a nickname. It's nearly 1,000 pages long with hundreds of provisions. But how did so much end up in one piece of legislation? And what does it really mean for Americans' everyday lives and the future of bipartisan politics? To help break it down, I'm joined by Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, a national centrist political advocacy group working to support more bipartisanship. He's a former White House aide who knows the inner workings of how bills like this get passed and why they often feel so frustrating to the average voter. Together, we'll talk about some of the key takeaways and the political strategies that make or break modern bills. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, when we provide all the day's news in just 10 minutes. It's fast, fair, fun, and on the go. I'm Erica Mandy. It's time for today's Special Edition Saturday. You ready? Let's do this. Ryan Clancy, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thanks for having me.
So first, can you just speak to how massive the One Big Beautiful Bill is? I mean, that's part of the reason I think people might feel a little lost about it, is there's so many policies in here. It's hundreds of pages long. Can you speak to that?
It just touches so many different parts of American life. It extends most of the tax cuts from the president's 2017 tax bill, along with several other new tax provisions, including campaign promises he made, like no tax on tips. It's got significant new money for immigration enforcement, for defense. To the extent that it generates savings, it pulls a lot of that out of Medicaid and the food stamp program, as well as some other domestic spending. So on balance, this bill, no matter what kind of budget forecaster you look at, it puts us another 3, 4, 5 trillion in debt over the next 10 years.
If this seems to be the trend now, kind of stuffing everything into one huge bill to force everyone's hand, what are the pros and cons of that versus maybe breaking these issues up into smaller, separate bills?
So this is actually part of a long-standing trend where this bill was passed under something called the budget reconciliation process. This is a procedure that was invented 50 years ago, and it was actually the initial intent of this bill was to be what reconciliation sounds like. Like, imagine a business gets to the end of the year and they're like, oh, we got to reconcile our books and make sure things are in balance. It was actually designed to be a deficit reduction vehicle. But what happened is the parties realized that they could game it, and they could throw a lot of things into this bill. And the big virtue of it is that it is one of the only kinds of legislation that is not subject to a Senate filibuster, which means you have to get typically 60 votes for that to pass the Senate. That usually means something has to be bipartisan. So the virtue of these reconciliation bills for the majority party is they can pass this huge piece of legislation on a totally party line vote. So this is how this bill passed. This is how President Biden passed most of the Inflation Reduction Act, the CARES Act. It's how Trump passed the first tax cuts. The only limitation to this bill, and people might have read about this, is you're only supposed to include direct budget items in this bill, which is to say it needs to involve money in, money out. So you can't, for example, change the asylum rules for regulation or for immigration through a bill like this. You can't change air quality regulations through a bill like this because that doesn't have a budget impact. So there's this very convoluted process people probably read about where the party actually lobbies somebody called the Senate parliamentarian, they're basically like the rule keeper of the Senate, to get this or that provision in a bill. But the parties have managed to figure out passing most of what they want through these party line reconciliation bills.
And both parties are doing it?
Oh my God, yes. It's President Obama did it. President Bush 1 did it. It's just too tempting for them because if they moved bills through the regular process, Those bills, number one, would actually probably stand the test of time more because there'd be bipartisan buy-in and both parties would be invested in the bill's success. And you could include more in it because it doesn't have all these budgetary limitations of the reconciliation bill. But the temptation is just too much for new presidents when they come in. Their whole team around them basically says to them, all right, Mr. President, look, let's try to pass one of these reconciliation bills. You can actually only do one per fiscal year. So it's not a coincidence that it's the one big, beautiful bill. And their strategy is let's just jam as much as we possibly can into this bill and try to force it through.
And before we dive into some of the biggest things we've heard about this bill, because they've been sticking points between parties and sometimes even within the Republican Party, since we're talking about bipartisanship, what do you think is in this bill that otherwise would be bipartisan if there weren't all these other issues? A couple things that maybe come to mind for me is the no tax on tips provision. There's the Trump accounts that give money to newborns. I know there's debate about it, but there's funding for the World Cup and the Olympics here in the U.S., funding for the Artemis Moon program and Mars missions. Are you thinking of those as at least bipartisan elements, or what comes to mind for you?
Absolutely. Like one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the corporate tax reform provisions, people forget sometimes that it was actually President Obama who proposed lowering the U.S. corporate tax rate. The idea being because the U.S. had a much higher corporate tax rate than other countries, it was making us uncompetitive. It was incentivizing businesses to go set up their headquarters or invest elsewhere around the world. Some of these other tax provisions, like the no tax on tips, it's popular. It probably would get some Democratic support, but it doesn't really do much to juice the economy. So the corporate tax provisions in isolation, there's an opening for bipartisan support. Even some of the Medicaid stuff, Democrats obviously strongly support this program, as do a lot of Republicans. And if you talk to Democrats, they will concede that there's fraud in the program, that there's ways it can be reformed. But the way the Republicans went about it, in just jamming everything into this singularly huge bill, it just makes it impossible to get any kind of meaningful bipartisanship.
So let's talk about those two big sticking points that have gotten a lot of attention. One being the tax breaks for wealthy Americans. You know, you separated out the corporate kind of tax breaks, but for wealthy Americans, it's obviously not bipartisan. And I know the Congressional Budget Office put out a nonpartisan analysis basically saying that this will make the rich richer and the poor poorer over time. Can you speak to that data and what type of analysis you're paying attention to?
I think the only honest way to look at this is right now, the upper income taxpayers, they don't need an additional tax cut. And this is not like a class warfare argument. So some folks on the right, they will say to you, and they're right, the top 10% of taxpayers in this country pay most of the federal taxes. And people in the bottom income quintile actually have negative federal taxes. They get money back from the federal government. So that's all true as far as it goes. But there's a point where you have to sit back and say, look, we are $37 trillion in debt. We have a $2 trillion deficit this year alone. At a certain point, we have to stop giving people tax cuts and layering on new spending, or we're all going to be in a boatload of trouble when our debt just becomes completely unsustainable. In that kind of scenario, do we really need to make sure that the upper level of taxpayers don't have their tax rate go from 37% to 39.6%? I don't think so. And interestingly enough, people might remember President Trump was actually toying with the idea of letting those very upper income tax breaks lapse because there's just not a lot of justification for it economically, and it costs a ton of money. But there was a bit of a revolt within the broader Republican Party, and in the end, those tax cuts stayed.
If we're being honest, is this really just about paying back top donors to politicians? Like, what is the motivation?
Well, look, along the way of the passage of this bill, you heard a lot of Republicans in Congress belabor the fact that, look, this is fiscally irresponsible. With all this debt we're in, we can't keep doing this. But there is a political momentum to this, where, remember, this is the signature domestic policy bill for President Trump. So if you are a Republican who stands in the way of this bill's passing, then you are basically torpedoing President Trump's first term. And then all the Republicans are going to be mad at you. And then you might lose the midterm elections. So even when the substance of the bill is not good, there is so much pressure on the people in the party to pass it so as not to make their party's president look bad. And look, you saw the same thing in reverse. In 2021, when inflation was already starting to pick up and people were warning when Joe Biden signed into law his big COVID stimulus bill, which was like $2 trillion. And people said, this could cause inflation and maybe we shouldn't do this. But in the end, the pressure is just so great that they feel that they have to roll over and sign on to it. And I think that's what happened here. These things just take on a political momentum all their own that overwhelms a lot of common sense policy considerations.
Still ahead, we're digging into some of the most impactful and controversial pieces of this bill, from how cuts to Medicaid and food stamps could affect millions of Americans, to the record amount of money going to border security, and why some say it still doesn't go far enough. Plus, when you might start to feel the impacts yourself. But first, a break for our sponsors. Have you ever used a website platform and given up because you couldn't get the site to look how you wanted? Some platforms have very strict templates where you can't break the mold, quite literally, and it can be really frustrating. But Wix.com gives you the freedom to build exactly the site you want for any business idea. And yet it's still just drag and drop, super easy and simple, no coding required. And you're not having to figure it out all yourself either. Wix does offer over 2,000 designer-made templates, but from there, they are fully customizable and they come with out-of-the-box business functionality. If you're looking to sell products or services, schedule appointments, and more, Wix.com has you covered with built-in solutions, no add-ons required. And if you want, there's an amazing AI image studio and tons of design effects. Wix has been pioneering in website tech for almost 20 years now. They understand web design and what it takes to run your own business. Ready to create your own website? Go to Wix.com. That's Wix.com to start building your website today. Thanks to Wix for sponsoring our show. The Newsworthy is also brought to you by Quince. I appreciate that whenever I want to update my closet, Quince has what I'm looking for with elevated, timeless, high-quality pieces, and yet it's still all affordable. I'm talking 100% European linen tops starting at $30, washable silk dresses and skirts, and so many other versatile warm weather pieces you'll reach for again and again. The best part? Everything with Quince is half the cost of similar brands. By working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middlemen, Quince gives you luxury without the markup. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. In fact, my husband recently started ordering from Quince too. And by the way, it's not just clothes. I'm loving my carry-on suitcase from Quince. The 360-degree spinner wheels make it super easy to maneuver. The interior compression panels work surprisingly well to help me fit everything I need in there. And it looks super cute and stylish, and I love the color. Give your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/newsworthy for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/newsworthy to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/newsworthy. Now back to my conversation with Ryan Clancy from No Labels. When it comes to trying to help pay for this bill and the deep cuts to Medicaid and SNAP benefits, which are food stamps, there's analysis that millions of people will lose health coverage. Some people are saying hungry kids won't be able to eat. So what is standing out about that? What do you think people need to know?
Look, if we're saying on balance, do we think it makes sense that the cost for upper income tax cuts should be less food stamps and less Medicaid? I think the only honest answer to that is no, for the same reasons we described earlier, that folks at that point on the income spectrum just don't need that help. With that said, one of the things that has gotten lost in the Medicaid debate is Medicaid is a program that was created in the 60s for disabled people, for single mothers with children, for people in significant poverty. And the scope and scale of that program has grown really significantly over time, to the point where you do have people on the program who are single, working age men with no kids, and yet they're getting access to Medicaid. They're getting that because when the Affordable Care Act passed in 2010, that included a significant Medicaid expansion where people much higher up the income scale could buy into Medicaid. And then as part of the COVID relief packages that passed, that also expanded Medicaid eligibility. So when people say, well, 12 million people are going to lose insurance under this, that isn't quite exactly true, because what will happen to some of them is that they will be able to get access and probably pay for health insurance on the private insurance market. Because remember, one of the reforms that came in under Obamacare was we now have these individual plan insurance exchanges in states across the country, and people can still buy those plans with subsidies. So some of the people who are losing Medicare, that's the option they'll go with from here. Look, there's a bigger issue here, and it's this. We are in a situation right now where the debts we are incurring as a country are totally unsustainable. We are now, for the first time in our history, paying more for interest payments on the debt, so on money we've already borrowed, than we are for our entire defense budget. What I don't think is a sensible approach is, when we're doing cuts, to just focus on Medicaid and food stamps, because you're walling off a huge chunk of the budget. If you really want to save money in the budget, if you really want to fix our debt issue, then you are going to have to do something about Social Security and Medicare, which are by far the biggest spending programs of the government. And you are going to have some additional tax money coming in. So someone somewhere is going to have to pay a little more taxes. There is no way around it unless you do those two things.
It's unprecedented funding for border security. What do you think? What stands out to you about that?
So those investments are smart. They're sensible for the most part. Same thing with the investments in defense. Those are good. The problem is that because this is a reconciliation bill, the only thing you can do on immigration is you can put in much more funding for border security. The problem is you can't address all the other problems with the immigration system. So questions like, what do we do with the Dreamers? How do we fix the asylum system so it's harder for people to game it and get in the country who shouldn't be coming in? What do we do about all the undocumented people who are already here? Is there any kind of path to citizenship or legal status? All of this stuff is left unaddressed. So it's important and critical to secure the border. In a lot of ways, that's the prerequisite to get progress on all the other things. But all those other things I talked about, you have to do those in a bipartisan fashion. You can't get those through in a reconciliation bill. So there's still a ton more to do.
It's very different than, say, a reform bill that was considered and did not pass that specifically addressed some of those issues when it comes to immigration.
Yes, there was a bill towards the end of the last Congress that was bipartisan that would have fixed a lot of these issues. We need more judges to hear asylum claims. We need to change the rules for asylum. America's immigration system really hasn't been comprehensively reformed since the 1960s.
Even though everyone agrees there's problems there.
Yeah, well, it's not only that they agree that there's problems there. The vast majority of the public actually agrees what the solution should look like. And it's really simple. Want a secure border. They want immigrants to be treated humanely. And they want an orderly system for people to be able to come here, because we are a land of opportunity and people believe that's part of the strength of our country. That's poll after poll, Democrat, Republican, Independent, they agree with that. The problem is you really haven't been able to get that in the political system over the last couple of years, because the Democrats, to be completely frank about it, they were the open borders party under Joe Biden. They did not do anything meaningful to stem an unprecedented wave of illegal immigration until the very end of the Biden presidency. On the other hand, the Trump administration has mostly just focused on immigration restrictionism. Let's stop immigrants from coming. Let's secure the border. That's not enough. It's not what the public wants. They do want a balanced approach. It's just neither party wants to give it to them.
For somebody listening who feels frustrated by that, what can they do, if anything?
Look, we're from No Labels, and we have been trying as hard as we can to find some kind of way to get the two parties to work together. So one, I would say you could sign up as a member and learn more about how we're trying to do that. The other thing I would say is you do see some evidence that people are starting to get so frustrated that things are starting to break. And I'm talking here about, you saw Elon Musk just announced he's creating a new party. Will that succeed or where that's going? It's too early to say. But there is no doubt that a growing chunk of the public is getting so dissatisfied by what the two parties are offering them that there are going to be some alternatives that emerge because people just won't put up with this forever.
When do you think most Americans will feel the impacts of this bill, and just a final thought about it?
Well, look, you will see some pretty immediate changes, obviously, when you file your next tax return. A lot of the changes to Medicaid and food stamps, those are going to phase in a little more over time. So it won't be so immediate, but certainly by early next year, people will really notice some changes in this bill for sure.
Thank you so much to Ryan Clancy and No Labels for the insights today. You can learn more at nolabels.org. If you found this episode helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend. We always appreciate you spreading the word. And of course, listen again each weekday when we provide all the day's news in about 10 minutes with our signature fast, fair, fun style. So we'll be back on Monday with the latest news to know. Until then, have a great rest of your weekend.